maybe MC and I can both talk a little bit about how we came to Berkeley. I think we had different journeys there, and really, I think part of what's been exciting about the project is I think we both kind of independently came to Berkeley and then met each other. And I think, I really feel strongly that the exhibition is a real merger, right, of our different takes and different research on Berkeley in a way that I hope is really exciting and new. I'll say for myself, I had been working for many years in revising my dissertation into a book, and I had been really interested in lesbian feminist theorizations around domesticity, and I had been working on histories of queer and lesbian communes. And then I really stumbled upon it. I had been doing research at Smith College and really stumbled upon Birkby's archive, and which is just enormous. I mean, really, and I had been very used to, like in a lot of my other chapters of the book, to making a lot of a little, right? There's not like a ton of archives of like queer communes. And then to stumble upon Birkby's archives, which is this vast archive of personal papers and architectural papers and drawings by her and by others. What I found, really kind of really generative about Birkby's archive is that she was somebody who was thinking so critically about what home meant and thinking about what home meant, right, at every level, right, at the level of the home space itself, right, and then the level of the community and the level of the city, and thinking about the relationship between the city and rural spaces, and also thinking about what are different identities, right? Her identity as a woman, her identity as a lesbian, right? How all of those identities might shape, right, someone's experience, right, of the built environment.
I think I have somewhat of a similar origin story to Stephen in that I encountered Birkby at Smith. I was there doing other archival research for a master's thesis. I was a Master's of Environmental Design student at Yale. And the thesis I was working on was a historical thesis about feminist spatial practices. I was thinking about different ways that um, feminist organizing could intervene on the kind of construction and reconfiguration of the built environment. And one chapter I was writing was about feminist building takeovers in the 1970s. There was actually kind of like a lot of them that happened like right at the beginning of the 1970s. And one of them that I found really, really exciting and interesting was this takeover of an abandoned village in the abandoned building in the East Village of New York City. And through the kind of time at Smith, I found that Birkby was actually a participant in this building takeover. And she documented it. She has flyers in her archive of that takeover. Um, and it was kind of an amazing thing because I think it was the first moment in that thesis project where I really saw an actual architect, like someone who was trained in the discipline of architecture, use the tools of architecture in kind of a feminist way. You know, this whole take group of women who were taking over the building were kicked out pretty quickly by the police. And she returns about a month later with members of the New York City real estate department to kind of prove to them that actually the building was in really great structural condition and would have been totally usable by this group. The police kicked them out on the kind of idea that it actually wasn't safe for them to be there. So she was disproving them and she was using her expertise as an architect to do that. And I think for me, someone who's actually at that moment transitioning from the field of architecture as a practicing architect into being an architectural historian, that was really exciting and inspiring to see in historical lens, like how the tools of architecture could be used in to feminist and even queer ends. I think her kind of take on education comes, and Stephen, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too, but I think it comes from her time at Yale. She did her degree in architecture at Yale, and it's really the place where she kind of encountered what she would call patriarchal education structures. So a very top-down way of understanding architectural education where, students were supposed to kind of adopt the methods and approach of the instructor that they're under the tutelage of. And she always had a problem with this and was deeply uncomfortable with it. And I think she felt leaving Yale that, how would women architects ever kind of think about or be able to imagine a feminist approach to architecture if it had already been kind of programmed by the schools of architecture to think in the exact opposite way, in a patriarchal, top-down kind of way. So she, has that kind of critique. And one of the ways she ends up acting on this is that in 1974, she meets a group of women at a conference at Washington University in St. Louis, where she's presenting on her fantasy project, which we can talk a little bit more about. Um, and this is the group of women that she ends up co-founding the Women's School of Planning and Architecture with. It's this kind of radical feminist separatist school that happens in the summers 1975 to 1979, 4 times in different locations around the US. And they would meet for about 2 weeks, live together, teach together. And they're experimenting with non-hierarchical ways of teaching architecture. So teachers teaching students, students teaching teachers, um, and also just really deconstructing things that, women didn't think they had access to, like learning construction and trade skills. And those industries were seen as really male and were very male dominated. But, how could women just get their hands on those tools and take them for their own?
I think for me was like was the real core of my interest in her, which I think, right, the moment that she's kind of beginning, that she's sort of, that she decides to leave Davis Brody and Associates, leave her kind of her working at this large firm, right, and to start pursuing her independent architectural practice, but also start really pursuing her career as an educator, right, both in the classroom and out of it, I think is a moment, right, of feminist and lesbian feminist consciousness raising. And that I think part of what that enabled, right, is to bring something like a fantasy workshop where she's encouraging women to draw their fantasies, right, and to reimagine the built environment is coming at a moment when I think the barrier, right, between educational spaces and right, everyday life and consciousness raising, right, as an everyday practice, and really consciousness raising as a kind of lens on everyday life, is really important, right? That part of what the fantasy project was tapping into was this question, right, from the feminist and lesbian feminist movement to think about your everyday life in political terms. To build on what MC was saying too, is I think she's also very inspired, right, um, in a different way by her experiences as an undergraduate at the Women's College at the University of North Carolina, where she really is discouraged, right, from exploring architecture, right, and because it's seen as a predominantly, and it is a predominantly and vastly predominantly male profession. She describes in her diaries like taking furtive looks, right, with a friend at architectural journals in the library. And that really struck me because I think people often have that kind of story of like sneaking to the library to look at like gay or lesbian materials. But I love that she was sneaking to the library to look at architectural journals. And it, I think, really speaks to, right, the degree to which, right, it's the degree to which that was an implicit barrier. And so I think that, some of her activism around architecture is joining with other women, like in the Women's School of Architecture, Women's School of Planning and Architecture, to try to challenge the profession, right, and expand the profession. But some of it's also about meeting women wherever they are, right, and encouraging them to challenge their own internalized conceptions about what is and isn't possible for them. We really tried, I think, in the exhibition to think about Birkby as our sort of way into this moment, right? And Birkby is, of course, our key figure, but she also is the kind of where we follow her right through all of these different kind of feminist and queer and other activist spaces.
then we kind of get into what we call feminist architectural intervention. So thinking about some of the stories we've already told you about how she uses the tools of architecture in the feminist movement. So a little intro to the Women's School of Planning and Architecture um, and to the Fifth Street Women's Building takeover that I described. But that, that leads us right into the fantasy project, which is at the heart of the exhibition. So, she takes that on in 1973. And so we really focus a lot on some of these earlier drawings that she's doing with, her close friends, Minnie and her kind of lesbian network. And then it follows the fantasy project a little bit later on to where she starts collaborating with Leslie Keynes Weissman, another feminist architect and her romantic and intellectual partner at that time. And they take the fantasy project nationwide and to the Women's School of Planning and Architecture. And those drawings are also amazing. They become kind of larger format. So we have a few of these larger format drawings that range, all of the drawings range from somewhat practical to the totally fantastical. Cities made out of jello, really kind of amazing and whimsical imaginations. The exhibition then actually kind of gets into the women's vernacular architecture project. After Birkby kind of wraps up the fantasy drawing project, she's very eager to go out into the world and see if she can identify any of the themes she was seeing emerging in the fantasy drawings in the actual built architecture of women in the US and actually a little bit beyond. But she travels to California and we have a lot of documents of this time when she's um, taking pictures, going and meeting women who are building buildings themselves, and also her kind of writings on this moment. Um, Interestingly, she meets Barbara Hammer, the famous lesbian filmmaker, and has a romantic relationship with her. And together they actually go and visit this Holyoke Dome, which is a stained glass dome made by a woman artist named Caroling, and document that together in a film. The exhibition then continues to Birkby's architectural practice. As Stephen alluded to earlier, she worked at Davis Brody and Associates, now Davis Brody Bond, at the beginning of her career. So we reflect on a few of those early projects that are quite large scale. The Long Island University Library Learning Center in particular is a really interesting one. And then go to her independent practice because in 1972 she really takes on her own work. Um, and those projects were really, interested in pulling out a couple of themes that really dovetail with the fantasy project. She's really interested in creating spaces for women, spaces of care. She ends up doing a lot of work actually kind of in addition to her home projects, she does some projects really thinking about spaces of care, for instance, for women recovering from alcoholism. So drawing out those kind of emergent themes in her practice, and also her real investment, her career-long investment in designing not just for women, but for people with disabilities and the elderly. So those are big themes in that part of the exhibition. And then basically the exhibition kind of moves downstairs and ends with the end of her life. In some ways, that part of the exhibition ends with the end of her life. Um, and there's a space to watch her films and do some interactive fantasy drawings yourself. So we're inviting people into the fantasy drawing project at that point.
One of the other questions for us, right, is to us, is at the final part of the section is to think through the legacy of Birkby's work. And so we talked very early on about approaching artists, right, and architects to try to bring that work into the present and future in lots of ways. Um, and and so one of the people one of the pieces is by the artist L.J. Roberts, who has done a lot of work kind of engaging in kind of lesbian and queer history, and um, and really kind of LJ really kind of joined us kind of in kind of really diving into Birkby's archive and creating this really large scale installation that really like it's hard to describe. I think when you see the installation shots of it next week, you'll get a better sense of it. But it's like it feels to me like entering into like Berkeley's like dream world, right? Because it's like all of the elements of the archive and the fantasy project just start to create this space that you can really enter into in a way that's really beautiful and exciting, right? The letters and the fantasy drawings and photographs. She has a diploma that she received from the Women's School of Planning and Architecture, right? It all kind of blurs together, and it's a combination of wheat pasting and neon and light boxes. It's hard to explain. It's very much kind of in and then also work that's kind of sewn together that is very much in keeping with LJ's and building off of LJ's other work. Um,
Mm.
I'll say kind of more generally, and maybe this is also a bridge, right, to talking about Chung and Audrey's work, is I think one of those threads we really wanted to draw out at the very sort of at that end of the exhibition is one of Birkby's last pieces of published writing is this piece that she wrote for Ms. Magazine called Designing for the Messiness of Life. And it's there that she really, I think, pulls out right, that to me, like what's kind of a lasting legacy of her work, right? That the question of feminist architecture ultimately is not just about, as MC was sort of alluding to, it's ultimately not just about it's not just designing for women, right? But it's about how thinking from a feminist lens can help us to think about the various ways that the built environment as it exists currently oppresses people, right, in various ways, right? And disables people in various ways, and how we can imagine a new environment right, that might allow for greater kinds of liberation and freedom. And so I think the final section of the exhibition, right, is really trying to open up, right, following Birkby and opening up the story of the exhibition from right, her specific experiences as a woman in the lesbian feminist movement, right, and drawing out the threads, right, of thinking about what the messiness of life might mean.
There's something I really love in our conversation, Stephen, with them that they talk about a kind of aliveness of Birkby's legacy and archive. And there's something about the kind of neons and textile that feels very like animate. And I think it really does something powerful to kind of bring forth her presence and legacy into the present and to like feel it in that immersive space. So I'll talk about the other artists. They're a group called Rehearsing. It's Chongu and Audrey Singh DeMello Fisher. And their work is really in dialogue with this group called Red Canary Song, which is kind of a grassroots organization of massage workers, sex workers, and allies of the Asian diaspora in New York, in Queens. And they are really centering the kind of fantasies and intertangled realities of one of the key organizers in that group, Lisa. And so they've spent a lot of time, Chong, many years with Lisa, um, interviewing her and thinking through what her architectural fantasies would be, and also what her architectural realities are, running a massage parlor in Queens that's heavily policed, and, has kind of a necessary transience to it and a necessary architectural kind of strategy of, you know, using materials, cheap materials around you to kind of make a homey environment and really difficult conditions. So the piece, like LJ's, is also very immersive. They're both trained as architects, or as designers, so they have that amazing skill. And the piece is kind of on one side of the room, more Lisa's realities and the reality of her space in the massage parlor, and then it slowly starts to kind of move into her architectural fantasies, which are more rendered and clear plastic wrap and cellophane and have this kind of almost ephemeral, beautiful, ethereal quality to them. I was thinking about one fantasy drawing that Birkby herself did. Um, and it's really interesting. It's actually kind of there's this whole thing in the 70s where in the late 60s that the whole new left is really obsessed with the figure of the dome. It's like this really symbol of the countercultural movement. So you'll see a lot of domes in these drawings because they're like trading on the kind of symbols of the countercultural movement at that time. But she has this really diagrammatic drawing of a kind of series of domes, and the idea is each of these domes or grouping of domes really kind of represent in spatial terms different forms of relationships. So, there's the idea of the drawing is that you actually enter into the first dome and you're alone or you're single. And then as she goes through this kind of series of different domes, we kind of see her experimenting with monogamy, having multiple relationships, polyamory. It's interesting because I think there's a real amazing kind of vibrant queerness to that drawing because, it's Birkby trying to both talk about and reflect her own romantic life and the way that her kind of intimate entanglements and romantic entanglements don't map onto the kind of heteronormative ideal of finding a partner, having a family, being stable. It actually, tracks her kind of movement through different relationships, and it also tracks types of relationships that it really rub against the kind of normative. But what's even more amazing about it for me is that she's trying to give a form or a spatial kind of um, attribution to that type of experience. She's imagining what it would be like to have a sequence of spaces that actually accommodate or enable like, that type of sexual and romantic and personal exploration. And that stands so in contradiction, right, to what we have so much of in the US and really around the world, the single family home, the suburb, the kind of insistence that the home, it's a stable place where, certain kind of regimes of sexual normativity are instantiated and enforced. Gender divisions of labor are instantiated and divorced or enforced. So I think that drawing to me was it's a moment in the archive that's really interesting where she's playing around with, how could space actually enable other queer forms of intimacy and romance and care and community.
I would just build on that too. I mean, I think a really core theme in her writing and thinking, but also that I think is also reflected in a lot of the other fantasy drawings of, and a lot of the other kind of ex spaces that are reflected in the exhibition, right, is a sense that part of also what heteronormative domesticity does is isolate people, right?
Mm,
That it's about, right, right, it's about privatizing us from the larger world. And you know, the part of what we see, right, in a lot of the fantasy drawings and Berkby's own, right, is trying to find a balance between like having spaces, right, of kind of self-care, as we might put it now, or kind of spaces to be able, I mean, that the dome drawing also includes a rest dome,
yeah.
importantly, right? So like take a break. And, and I think that's important, right? But also, right, to think about more communal spaces, right? A lot of the fantasy drawings have spaces like for someone to be alone, and then also spaces to be together, right? There's spaces that like, how do I have an urban space? A lot of the drawings have like, it's both a rural space, but then there's a city not too far away. I'm thinking too about one of Berkby's really amazing films is of um, of kind of a rural retreat that a rural retreat, right? Sort of where is it on? It's on Jill Johnston's farm. I'm forgetting
Yeah, yeah, it's in
on
Peekskill, Bill Johnson's farm.
where she's just filming sort of kind of women in nature together, like, and it's really just about that sense of togetherness, right? That I think that a lot of contemporary architecture, right in the post-war period, really sort of guarded against,
Mm.
and so um, I think that she's trying to think critically about how to create what, like, as MC was saying, like sort of create spaces that give more relational possibility, right, in really important ways. And I think there's something fundamentally queer about that.
For me, Birkby in a way was less invested in seeing the actual, her drawings and the drawings of those she taught, those folks she taught themselves becoming concrete reality. but I think she was very invested in, I guess, engendering that kind of mode of thinking and mode of working that, what would become a reality for her in the future was that, women and marginalized people could get together and think outside of the norms of the kind of patriarchal architectural institutions. Um, and I still, I mean, it's hard to be optimistic about anything right now in the US, but I still remain, optimistic that we can use feminist and queer approaches to architecture to think together in other ways in the future and to kind of unlearn the ways we've been taught architecture even still today.
Maybe I'll try to answer that too. I mean, I think um, I find that I want to answer just yes, that I want to believe that there will be a future where our built environments will give us a greater sense of possibility. But I think that's something also that's really exciting to me and about, one thing I'm excited to see more of when the exhibition is up is watching. I think MC and I have both spent now a lot of time with Birkby, and I
Yeah.
think one thing that's amazing about an exhibition, right, is getting to watch other people encounter her work for the first time. And I think like on the one hand, and I think also the space of the Center for Architecture, as a exhibition space is interesting in terms of who it will bring. But I hope that architects, right, and designers who are coming into that space look at it and question, right, the basic forms that they're working with. But I also think for people who are not professional architects and designers, I think that part of what Birkby's work also encourages, right, is just a critical lens on our everyday life, right? Taking that again, that basic that 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 basic insight, right, of feminist practice and theory, right, of looking at your everyday life and thinking about what are the small moves that we can make, the small interventions that we can make to give ourselves more space, to be able to move more freely. And and I mean move more freely, like both in literal ways, right, being able to move how we move through space, and more figurative ways about how we move through our lives. And I hope that Birkby's work in the exhibition really enable that conversation, right, to happen at both levels, both right in a kind of utopic, future-oriented way, but also in a more pragmatic and in the moment way too, right? That we can't immediately build right the fantasy environments that we're seeing, but we can start to make small changes in our everyday lives that maybe open up more possibilities. And I think it is right such a painful and anxious moment in so many ways that I think being able to think right both in those future oriented and present oriented and small and large ways is actually really important and an important lesson from Birkby.
Yeah, I
Thank
would
you.
just say to that point too that it's been interesting having conversations with friends and throughout this last run of the exhibition that where we've been getting a lot of work done as, after the inauguration. And I think that I've had moments personally where fantasy feels almost too luxurious, right? When like a lot of folks, queer and trans communities are just struggling for survival right now. But I think I've also come around to a sense that, we have to have fantasy, we have to have that horizon, and we have to think about that to have something to fight for. And I think that's what I'm hopeful and I'm excited to see people interact with the exhibition that, fantasy can give that energy and that lifeblood to kind of resistance.